Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I made it through my trade show in New York last week. I am off to San Diego this week for a smaller pharma conference where I have to give a presentation. In fact, I'm recording this intro before I leave, but I'm having it set up to go out on Tuesday, so if something horrible happens in that interval, sorry, man. But the thing about the back-to-back work events meant that I couldn't really go to either of the other events that I historically like to attend. The Antiquarian Book Fair, the International Antiquarian Book Fair in New York City, and the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. I could maybe have made a trip into NYC for the fair on Saturday, but I really needed to rest, and I had some reading to do, and there's still lots of work to get done for the day job and for the podcast. So, it just wasn't going to happen. And TCAF, that Toronto event, used to be held a few weeks later before the pandemic, Mother's Day weekend, which was always my joke that it gave me an excuse to leave the country for Mother's Day. But they rescheduled that. And between the back-to-back pharma events and the fact that almost all the special guests they were bringing in were people I didn't know, I really couldn't bring myself to fly up to Toronto for the weekend. But Amy and I are hoping to go later this summer so we can catch up with friends, hit one of our favorite restaurants, and otherwise just get the whole Toronto experience. But it really is just another one of those weird acknowledgments of aging that I just can't hammer back-to-back-to-back events like I once did. I think the multi-year hiatus of the pandemic is a factor, too, getting me kind of accustomed to not traveling quite so much in seasonal bursts after a couple of years of no travel at all. But anyway, I am bummed to have missed both events. If anyone went to either of those, I hope you had a great time. If you went to both of those, I hope you had a great time at both of them. The upside is I did manage to get in an in-person podcast immediately following the trade show in New York. Basically, we finished up day 3 at 1 p.m. I just went over to the number 7 and started the trek, and that brings us to this week's show. So my guest this time is the author John Wray, who has an awesome new novel out now called Gone to the Wolves from FSG. Gone to the Wolves it's about the metal scene in the late 80s and 90s, sort of, well, for the scope of the novel, spanning Gulf Coast, Florida, L.A., and the wilds of Norway. Well, Oslo and then the wilds of Norway. And when I say metal, I mean heavy metal, hair metal, and especially death metal, which becomes the center of the scene that John's writing about in the novel. And he focuses on this trio of friends, each of whom find their way into the scene and have varying degrees of difficulty in coping with the lifestyle, as it were. And things ultimately get dangerous, and there's a hero's quest involved, but that's almost beside the point compared to just I'd say the evocation he makes of both the times and what that metal scene was like at a time when, well, John will talk about it extensively during the show. What I want to say is Gone to the Wolves is a fantastic read. Sweeps the reader along. There's a very troubled protagonist of the three friends. He's sort of the lead. He's a teenager when the book starts with a bad past, and he finds himself in the metal scene. By which I mean finds himself. Not that he's accidentally there, but this is what it means, seeing those acts and trading tapes and bullshitting about philosophy and sound theory and theology and tuning. It all helps shape his identity as he and his friends look to escape middle of nowhere Florida. And the characters are really such vivid and difficult people. And there's this degree of longing each one of them has for sometimes irreconcilable things, but it makes them totally relatable to anyone who was a teen misfit, like me, or I assume anyone listening to this show. Chances are you're not well-adjusted, or you weren't well-adjusted when you were young if you find yourself listening to this. But even the supporting characters that he brings in, they have a depth to them, a sense of having lived before they entered the book, if that makes sense. Also, I want to point out, while the book is about the metal scene in the 80s and 90s, you do not need to know anything about that. I have scant knowledge, just really bare understanding of death metal, especially. It was no hindrance whatsoever in enjoying the living heck out of this novel. John does this incredible job of evoking the feeling of listening to this music, of being in the audience at the shows, without the reader needing the direct experience to correlate to that. That said, John has made a couple of playlists for the book, and we'll talk about those, and I'll put links to those in the show notes for this one. But go read Gone to the Wolves. It is a great and fun novel of a subculture I've never seen covered. We talk about it a little. There's one novel that refers to part of the scene, but not, making it the centerpiece as John does here. And there is a plot that veers into danger, and it's got some thrills, and there are moments of utter pathos with the lead characters and the lostness and longing that they have. You'll miss them when you close the book. Anyway, as caveats go, we did record this in person, as I mentioned, and John ate a home-baked cookie at one point. About 20 minutes in, you can hear the chomping a little bit. It looked really good. There were two of them, and I just couldn't bring myself to eat the second one, knowing that I was going to be doing a bunch of talking and would probably be chewing on mic. But anyway, you might hear me drooling a little along with his chewing. Oh, and there's a helicopter around half an hour in. It shows up again a little bit later. It's got this reverb that I just couldn't get rid of without making the vocals sound really weird. The other thing I should mention is that I've been to John's house once before for a different podcast, because he rents out rooms to other writers as offices. And when I recorded with Nathan Englander in March of 2019, this is where we got together. It was funny because when I got the address from John's publicist, I thought, man, that seems really familiar. That number and that street in Brooklyn. But anyway, I looked it up, realized it was the same place, so that prepared me for not having some horrible deja vu experience. And John and I will talk about the house and the community of writers he's built there. Anyway, here's John's bio. John Wray is the author of Godsend, The Lost Time Accidents, Lowboy, Canaan's Tongue, and The Right Hand of Sleep. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Award, a Cullman Fellowship from the New York Public Library, and a Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellowship from the American Academy in Berlin, he was named one of Granta's Best Young Artists in 2007. A citizen of the United States and Austria, he lives in New York City. His new novel is Gone to the Wolves. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with John Wray. Tell me where the book began for you. Your secret origin story of Gone to the Wolves.
I have to say that the book probably began for me with a friendship with this kid from Florida that I got to know. I can't even remember exactly how I got to know him. I mean, he just suddenly was there, that way in New York City, sometimes, at least when you're young, when you're in your 20s, that someone just kind of sprouts like a mushroom into your social life and you don't quite know where they came from. It was this kid named Jared, a few years younger than I was at the time, and he was just such an original. He'd come to New York to be an artist in whatever sense that would prove to be. And he was from Venice, Florida, and he just got talking to me at some party about how Venice, Florida used to be the winter headquarters of Barnum and Bailey, which is why it attracted all of these basically freaks, and carnival people and circus people. And from there, he kind of branched out to telling me all sorts of things about small town Florida, Gulf Coast Florida, and how different it was from what we think of as Florida, like Miami or the Keys or something, like a completely different planet. And he just started telling me anecdote after anecdote, and he himself was so charming and interesting, but also the stories he was telling me, I immediately realized that, at some point they would have to find their way into something that I was writing. So interestingly enough, I don't think Gone to the Wolves began with heavy metal or with an idea that I had to write a novel about metal. It began more with an interest in Florida, I think. And then in the course of revisiting those conversations, some of which I had taped, I think I was talking to my editor at FSG, Eric Chinsky, and I found out that he in high school, he's also almost exactly the same age as I am, had played in a metal band. I think they were called, he'll be so mad if I get this wrong.
We can put it in the...
It was one of these classic metal band names like Psychosis or something. Yeah. And then we sort of got chatting, and I told him that I had a history with metal too. And we realized that neither of us could think of a novel that was about that world. And that, of course, got us both very curious about it. And it certainly motivated me to check it out and see whether that was actually true. I think, of course, there are some things that have been written about metal.
There's a Liz Hand novel that tangentially touches the world that you end up reaching with this one, but it's not the focus.
Is that Available Dark?
Yeah, it's one of the Cass Neary novels. Right. Think of the second one, not Hard Light. But that's the only one that I could think of when I was reading it. I'm like, I don't think anybody's really covered this scene. I mean, Liz had her,
I mean, there are some people who kind of visited or touch on it tangentially. And of course, metal fans and metal bands are often kind of referenced ironically or in a campy sort of way by pop culture. But I wasn't interested in any of that. I was interested in writing a novel that was really going to be a celebration and an investigation without prejudice of this world, and of course a recollection of what things were like when I was younger. But when I talked to my editor about it and tried to explain to him what I was interested in doing, at some point he stopped me and said, "Oh, it sounds to me like you just kind of want to do for heavy metal what Moby Dick did for fishing." And I'm not sure he meant that in an encouraging way.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to take it at all. Jeez.
But I sort of thought I said, basically.
Yeah.
So that's how it started, I guess.
You remember your first metal experience? It's usually, for people our age, it's going to be incredibly young and something we didn't quite get. But
well, my first...
Consciously knowing this is what it is.
Oh, I see what you're asking. Yeah. I was going to say my first sort of live music experience that touched on metal was probably the band Black Flag in the later 80s when they were kind of gravitating more towards sort of metal influences from straight up hardcore. I began more as a hardcore kid. But my first encounter with anything that one could generously consider to be metal was when I was about 6 years old, and my next door neighbors, the Deep Pasquales, who were a bunch of brothers, found me when I was kind of outside drawing, dragons and unicorns or something on the sidewalk, and they said, "Come here." And they're much older, and they grabbed me and dragged me out into the middle of the sort of black, asphalt street that we lived on, and they brought down a copy of the AC/DC album Back in Black, which had just come out.
Yeah.
And they were like, "Draw this." And I was like, "Okay." And I started like, no. The whole street. So they actually stood by me and watched as I drew a giant very sloppy, rendition of AC/DC's AC/DC's Back in Black in white chalk on this black city street. And then, of course, they played me the record, and I think I loved AC/DC from the jump. There's something about AC/DC, they're heavy and all of that, but they appeal to kids.
Yeah, there's a pop. I would say there's a melodiousness to their stuff.
And a sort of merriment to what they're doing. Yeah. I mean, AC/DC is just purely fun music. That not everyone would consider them a metal band, but I do. I mean, you can't consider Motley Crue or Poison metal and not consider AC/DC metal.
Yeah, I thought you were either going to have Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, or Blue Oyster Cult. Again, we all shade what was metal and what was weird rock.
Well, Black Sabbath was my first real passion in the world of metal. I mean, that is just another band, I guess, similar to AC/DC in a way. Just another band that you almost can't. You can't just kind of like them, You can definitely hate them, and I know many people who do. But if you kind of like them, you're going to love them because, again, they're extremely fun. And you kind of understand after a while that these are probably pretty likable, maybe even slightly cuddly guys, and so funny in so many different ways. And the music is so fantastically good. I still, with great pleasure, listen to those first 5 or 6 Black Sabbath records. I have them all downstairs on vinyl, and I love playing them when no one else is in the house.
Which raises the question of exactly how much hardcore metal were you listening to in the process of working on this book, and how much did it drive your family and friends nuts?
Yeah, well, my wife is from Mexico City, and metal is still a big deal down there.
I had no idea.
Yeah, metal actually is still very much a going concern in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. It's sort of Latin America and Eastern Europe. Those are the two strongholds, maybe Scandinavia a little bit. But I think the very first time we ever met over dinner at a friend's house, we were talking about music, and I remember her telling me, I pretty much listen to a little bit of every kind of music, except heavy metal. So she's had a rough...
Covering up your pentagram tattoo with that.
She's had a rough few years.
Yeah. Tell me about the theological aspects of the book. I mean, there's the forbidden interval comes up early on. There's a lot of thought about what goes into the philosophy of the music, and then I wouldn't even say anti-Christian, but sort of pre-Christian mentalities that comes out through,
with the black metal movement in Scandinavia, which is sort of where the book goes eventually, they would certainly have considered themselves anti-Christian, no questions asked, absolutely.
But the way you position it in the book, it's still there's a difference between anti-Christian and pre-Christian. There's being against Christianity, but setting yourself up in opposition, falling into the same mold, as opposed to, throwing it out the window completely.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Which I thought was a really neat way of framing it in the course of the book.
Well, I mean, to me, this book is really about these 3 friends who are very different from one another, but initially drawn together through their passion for metal, for this sort of music, where they live at the time when they're coming up, in the 80s in small town Florida, is very much an underground kind of music. And like any sort of underground cultural moment, it draws people together very, very tightly. But they're very different people, these 3 characters, Kip, Kira, and Leslie Z, and they are interested in different aspects of metal for different reasons, and eventually they kind of gravitate towards very different scenes. But in a way, my favorite character is kind of the best friend of our protagonist, this kid named Leslie, who is not only a kind of metal super fan in a very geeky way, but he really is almost a philosopher of the art form, and gets extremely brainy and extremely deeply into not just the sort of sensibility and the ideologies of these various kind of strains of metal, which were already at that point starting to split off and form their own subcultures. But also, he is fascinated by the theology of it then later, because there were some groups that towards the end of the 80s or the early 90s, started to
enact.
Yeah, they started to practice metal almost as a kind of ersatz religion, and you really could speak about theology in their case. These black metal bands in Scandinavia who went on to become so infamous for burning churches and killing people and so on.
Yes, I feel bad because we grew up with the Satan worship panic just a few years early.
That's right.
It wasn't valid at that point, and 10 years
it was
later,
completely off base.
Yeah, there it makes sense, but with us, it's just Dungeons and Dragons. It's okay.
Yeah.
We weren't really nuts. But
I actually think that the satanic panic that was really kind of reaching ahead when I was a teenager in the 80s. Ironically, I think went some way towards serving as an inspiration for a lot of these Scandinavian black metal kids, because they saw how much press and attention these sort of satanic postures attracted in the United States. And I think they, consciously or not, realized that was a pretty fruitful way to go if you were trying to attract global attention to your little provincial neck of the woods in semi-rural Norway. They just took it one step further and said, we're actually going to do the things that these heavy metal kids in the United States were accused of doing.
Yeah. And the sense in the book, you mentioned your three protagonists and their involvement in the scene. One of the things I found weirdly fascinating was the notion that for none of them was there the idea of we're going to become musicians.
Yeah.
There's just we're aficionados of the scene. It defines who we are and the life choices we make, but they never have we should get a guitar and we should start doing this, that, and the other.
Well, I very intentionally, and it says at one point in the book that between the three of them, they had virtually no musical ability whatsoever. They could barely even carry a tune. And I did that very consciously and intentionally.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've almost never encountered a novel about rock and roll. I mean, forget about heavy metal, any type of popular music really, that didn't run into this problem of, as the reader, getting the impression very quickly that the author was sort of trying to be cooler than he or she really was, and using kind of music and using these rock stars they were writing about.
You can just say the ground beneath their feet. You can say it's Rushdie. It's okay. He's not listening.
Well,
I'm just kidding.
I was actually thinking of some other books, some of them by friends of mine, so I can absolutely name no names.
The upside for me is that nobody likes me.
But I feel like I don't really have to name any specific names because it seemed almost universal to me. Yeah. When I first thought about writing something about music in general, and then rock more specifically and metal more specifically, I started to worry about this very thing, and I thought, oh God, what if I put in all this work into writing a book, and at the end, it just seems like this nerdy author
wannabe rock star
was kind of projecting himself onto these masterful, gifted musicians, because that's often the choice, which is understandable. If someone decides they're going to write a novel about musicians, of course they want to write a novel about really gifted and talented and charismatic and maybe even successful musicians, Don DeLillo did it in Great Jones Street, and he carried it off, I think, but that's only because that book isn't really about music at all. It's just kind of, the characters in that book could just as easily have been, members of the Weather Underground or soldiers in Vietnam. It doesn't really matter. So I was kind of stymied by this problem for a while, a few weeks, maybe even a month or so. And then suddenly I just woke up one morning with the very obvious solution, which is not to write about the musicians primarily, or rock stars in any way, having them maybe occasionally put in an appearance.
I do have a question of whether Vince Neil is threatening to sue you, but other than that, I'm not good.
Well, that was really fun. I couldn't resist that. But I just realized that if I made my characters kind of if I put them on the fringe of these scenes, you know, passionate believers and super fans and kids who write and publish the zines, you know, the people who actually make up the community more, but never tried to make them particularly cool, that I could sort of maybe end up with a book that was a tribute to a culture without trying to co-opt it in some way to make myself look cool.
You write from the perspective of the audience.
Yeah.
And that's, most people don't do that because they want to, someone is the chosen one and someone has to be, I mean, you do have heroics that take place in here, but it's,
but they're more, I think they're more heroic because they happen in spite of the many foibles and frailties and shortcomings of the characters, you know?
Yeah, there are enough instances of guys seriously screwing up what they're doing, but
yeah, they're screw-ups, basically, these three kids.
Yeah. There is a moment when Leslie has a transformation midway through the book that all I could think of, I don't know if you were a fan of it, Pete Baggs' hate comics from the 90s.
I know those comics.
Yeah, George P. Hamilton, the black roommate that he has, where he kind of nerds out and we find out more of George's secret life. I'm like, I don't think Leslie's based on George, but you know, I kind of like visualizing him as that.
Leslie's based on someone very, very different and someone that I know quite well. Leslie is actually the character who's specifically based on someone that I know. But as you mentioned that, I now remember, I mean, I had hate comics when I was, you know, they're probably...
We were the same age, 1990,
They're probably in my basement right now.
Yeah.
And I do remember that the sort of annoying know-it-all roommate that he had in that comic.
Not that I like, you know, making people realize that, oh my God, these things were subconsciously here the whole time.
Probably were, though.
But how much, you know, when we talk about that sense of audience, that sense of the people who are on the scene but not in the scene itself, how much do you see the metal version that you write about here correlating to other art forms, whether it's other forms of music or other, you know, writing, fine art, whatever it is? Do you see that same level of interaction or that same degree of relationship between audience and artists that you're getting at in the book?
I think so. I think especially if you're talking about small, homegrown kind of DIY scenes that sprout up somewhere, you know, or any sort of underground arts movement. Almost by definition, those sorts of scenes don't have a tremendous amount of distance built in, you know, between the audience, the fans, and the performers. Often they're indistinguishable from one another, you know. I don't think that's particular to the underground metal scene in the 80s and 90s, or even to music in general. I mean, you certainly saw it in hardcore, you know, sort of DC area hardcore around the same time. But I'm sure you could find it in visual art, in comics, in, you know, just about anything, except maybe writing, because writers are so weird and solitary and even more awkward around one another than the characters in my novel are.
Hard to believe. And yet, from all the writers I've met, I think that holds up.
It's pretty well. Yeah, pretty accurate.
The challenge of writing pre-cell phone, pre-internet fiction?
It's easier.
Yeah?
I think it's way easier because there are just all these elements you don't have to think about or allow for. If someone drifts off, if someone goes for a walk and leaves the scene of the action, they don't know what happened until they get back, you know?
There's no text. Somebody writes a letter and they've got to wait a couple of weeks.
I think it's much more difficult now, especially, I mean, not just in books, but in film, if you're...
And our lives in general.
And our lives in general. But if you're writing like a thriller, you know, you have to allow for the fact that people can be warned ahead of time. All sorts of information can be transmitted.
Or you need a MacGuffin that somehow they drop their phone and...
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting to see. That's a good point that you make, how often...
A mechanism has to
there'll
happen.
Be some random sort of MacGuffin that makes it impossible to use one's cell phone. I mean, the most basic is just to have them run out of juice, I guess. But
Or as I had when I left Peter Sheldall's place in Bovina, New York, after we finished recording, and tried to get the GPS to go home and discovered there's no cell coverage up in the Catskills. And I pretty much remember the roads I came in on. I'm going to find out if I remember them that well in the other direction. And eventually, 40 minutes into it, I finally picked up a signal and realized that's about 5 miles off route, but not bad.
One of the many great things about the Catskills. Yeah, I actually have never written a novel that was set in the era of the cell phone. I mean, my last book, there is a cell phone, like a really early basic flip phone kind of made casual reference to early on. But then the characters traveled to Afghanistan where no one had them.
Yeah, the global, what was the name of Iridium? That was the satellite network once upon a time. Only because a friend of mine was a journalist in that world. I will tell you from the day job, when I travel down to D.C. on the train, if you see congressmen or senators, flip phones.
Oh.
Yep. Not hackable. And Bill Pascrell, the congressman from the Paterson, New Jersey area, 2 flip phones. And I'm just like, that makes all the sense in the world. Okay, that's I would never think to do this. Oh, personal and business stuff.
Oh, I see.
Or maybe he's like Joe Dumars when he's got the 2 phones up when he's talking simultaneously to people. But,
or one for his family and one for the prostitutes.
Yeah, looking at Bill.
I'm making no assumptions about the respected senator from New Jersey.
No, I will tell you the story off mic about how I knew I was a true DC habitué, but didn't involve my using prostitutes, but did involve how you approach someone who was accused of the same. But yeah, seeing people in our day and age just using flip phones, it's like, oh, you don't need to be texting at high speed and shooting pictures of your meals or anything. You're just using this to actually handle phone calls. But
I have to respect that.
Yeah, it is a different world. But tell me about the 80s Florida that you were hearing these stories about, and how whether it corresponded to anything from your upbringing. Came up in Buffalo, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Buffalo. Actually, during the sort of, how should I put this? Basically, when the band Cannibal Corpse, which is referenced in the very first sentence of this novel, were kind of coming up in the scene there. So we're roughly contemporaries. It's so funny because to most people, that even just the name Cannibal Corpse is so, they assume that this must be an extremely fringe band that about 100 weirdos listen to in their basements. But in fact, that band went on to sell hundreds of thousands of records. I mean, as many records as a lot of mainstream acts of the time were doing, because there was this moment, mostly in Florida, right at the time that my book begins, when so-called death metal, which most people can't even, most people probably don't even really know what that sounds like, was a real global commercial musical force. It was a very brief period of time. It was only about maybe 2-3 years, but it was such an unlikely time. I think that's part of what drew me to it. It's this incredibly difficult music to listen to, really, with no aspect to it that you could ever characterize as commercial, that was nevertheless, for God knows what reason, selling like hotcakes across the world.
Pissing off one's parents.
I guess that would
still
be
a universal driver for this stuff.
I suppose that must be a big part of it. But, people were moving from Scandinavia to Tampa, Florida, just to be closer to what they saw as the most exciting musical scene of the moment globally.
And it all puts me in mind again of that pre-internet world, where these things happened, where geography mattered.
Yeah.
Where things are so virtual nowadays, which again is why I'm glad we're sitting down in person and talking. That sense where we all had to go somewhere, the same way Seattle birthed what it birthed, right? And that a couple of years later, that people were moving to these places to actually be part of something. And
that was such a fascinating thing in those days, how the word would get out and rumors would kind of circulate. I mean, I remember at least a couple years before the big grunge explosion in Seattle, hearing people say that, oh yeah, there's this stuff happening in Seattle and these bands, and, getting a couple cassettes to listen to and not necessarily thinking that much of them. And then suddenly this thing, but it was more of a slow build in those days.
Sure.
And that's, of course, not the case anymore. But that's definitely the case in the world that I write about in Gone to the Wolves.
Great nostalgia for that time?
I do feel nostalgia for it. Yeah. I mean, I'm exactly the same age as the characters in the novel are. I guess on purpose. It seems to me almost, I remember when I was writing it, it almost seemed like a happy accident that they were exactly the same age as me. But I don't think that's probably true. So, of course, when I'm writing about their youth and you know, falling in love and getting high at the, you know, out at the bonfire on the weekend and getting into trouble with the local cops and all of that stuff, of course, I'm writing about the times that sort of stuff happened to me. It didn't happen to me in Florida. It happened to me in sort of upstate New York and southern Canada. But that really makes no difference. There's far more of my own youth in this book than in any other book that I've ever written.
Was it a change for you, bringing your own life in this much? Not necessarily explicitly, but...
Yeah, it was a change. It was a change, but because I wasn't necessarily writing about my entire life and didn't have to cover all the stuff that I'd be bummed to revisit, you know, that's the wonderful thing when you write a novel. You know, you're in charge of which way the camera is pointed. You know,
or so you think,
or so you think. Yeah. It was. I mean, this book was incredibly fun for me to write. It was by far the most fun to write of any book that I've written, and I think for the first time when I finished, I was a little bit sad it was over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I generally never feel that way. Usually I feel nothing but an enormous wave of relief. Yeah, for sure. Because it takes years, you know. It's like going to college or something. Every time you sit down to write a book, it's about that length of time. And you're going to be a different person when you're done than when you started, in part because of the experience of writing the book, but also just because 4 or 5 years have gone by, if you're slow the way I am. And in this case, I almost could have gone right back to the beginning and started over because in the way that some people have a lot of fun in college, some people don't. In this particular college experience, things were pretty fun.
When you talk about those changes, what do you recognize about yourself that's different? Knowing that, well, I don't know how much of this overlap with pandemic era writing also, and knowing that that's going to be a huge external factor that changes one's life, unless you're a writer, in which case nothing changes, as all my cartoonist pals tell me. But,
right.
You know, how did you change over the course of the book?
Well, it's very hard to say how much of the changes that I experienced, how many of those changes were driven by the book or by the writing, or, you know, I mean, in the period of time that I was writing this book, enormous changes happened to me in my personal life. I got married, I had a baby, and of course the pandemic, obviously. So I'm a hugely different person than I was when I started. I'm about 43 years older, for one thing. But I'm also a little bit more mellow, maybe, which is a very funny thing to say, that writing a novel about extreme forms of underground metal made me a mellower person than I was when I started.
Sometimes you need to get something out of your system.
I guess so.
I will tell you a story off mic about a similar experience where I thought I should be emotionally traumatized, but luckily I created a form of art that got it out of me. So,
well, you know, there's something to be said for catharsis, you know, and in my experience, a lot of the metal guys that I've gotten to know through writing this novel, but also working as a music journalist in the past, I was always struck by how well-adjusted, friendly, and open a lot of these scary-looking metal guys with long flowing beards and wearing black robes actually turned out to be. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe metal is therapeutic in some way.
Well, it was the big joke when they started doing the Osbournes, you know, reality show, that people had the Ozzy Osbourne shouldn't be like a down home, you know, dad or anything. It's like, bad news. He's probably not doing that for the cameras. You know, this is probably, you know, long term. He was. No,
that's really who he is. And that's, of course, why that show worked and was as charming as it was. I mean, imagine if the Osbournes had really been, you know, imagine if the Ozzy that you saw in the Osbournes was some kind of scary, frightening, satanic guy who bit the heads off bats. It actually would have been a worse show.
Yeah.
A much worse show.
So writing to music?
That is hard for me, although I did do it quite a bit with Gone to the Wolves. My rule is there cannot be any type of singing or any the human voice cannot appear.
Even if it's non-English? Okay. Or you might have multiple languages, so I don't know.
I mean, I suppose some kind of like guttural droning or chanting might be okay. I don't know. But my rule for myself is no vocals of any kind.
Yeah.
But fortunately, even within the metal genre, which has branched off into so many interesting subgenres, there's a lot of instrumental music and a lot of music that very closely approximates almost like a sort of Indian raga in its kind of repetitiveness and its droniness. I mean, there's a whole genre of metal called drone metal, which turns out to be great to write to.
Yeah, I kind of suspected that. That was I don't think this guy's listening to people actually screaming and
No, I mean, of course I had to revisit some of those bands and listen to them.
But not in the process of not physically
while
writing.
I was writing. No, oh my God, listening to Deicide or Dark Throne while you're trying to write would be a real challenge.
Tell me about the writing practice for you. You mentioned being slow, but I'm still working on my first thing at 52, so there's different degrees of slowness. What's a writing day or week, I guess? Writing
for me is it's a slow and steady drip. I subscribe to that corny sort of Graham Greene approach to writing, which is simply having a word count that you try to adhere to every day and not vastly exceeding it. I try to write, when I'm working on a first draft, I'll try to write 500 words in a day. And that is really not very much if you think about it. And once you get the ball rolling and you have a certain amount of momentum going with a project, I find that it's not that hard to get going on any given day. You sit down, you read what you wrote the day before or last few days, and you kind of fall back into the pocket, and you can usually keep going. Whether what you produce is good or not can't bother you too much. You can't let it bother you too much.
This would be the part where I haven't finished anything in 52 years, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be bad until it gets good. I didn't understand that when I was starting out, but this is my 6th book. So at this point, if I haven't gotten even a little bit wiser in all this time, then I'd really be in trouble.
Yeah. What do you find easier or more difficult?
I just put myself under less pressure, and I have a bit more faith in the possibility that things will eventually get to be a lot more interesting and entertaining and engaging than they were when I first sat down and wrote them. I often compare revision to the sort of dream you have if you've gone out to a party the night before or to a bar, and you're lying in bed the next morning, as sometimes happens to me, revisiting all the awkward, stupid things you said in the course of the night and wishing that you didn't, there was some way to sort of redo. You can redo it with writing, It's like sitting down and having a conversation with someone that you may not know or see, in this case, the potential reader, I guess, but you get to sort of work on everything you say as much as you want. You can rewind the tape and tweak it anywhere you want to be until you end up being the most entertaining person at the bar. Mm-hmm. You have endless time to do so, although of course you don't want to fall into a loop of constantly revising. Yeah. In a way, that's the hardest part of the entire writing process, is knowing when to stop.
And what was that? Do you have a moment where it occurred to you, either in the process of book one, or is that a step each time that it's, I'm just going to write this?
My first book took me a very long time to get done. But, I always have these kind of moments of hubris where I think, oh, no, I think it's done now. And if someone, I think with my first book, I was caught at I happened to meet someone. I happened to meet an agent at the time when I was feeling like maybe it was done. The sort of peak that came right before another valley. She took it away from me, and then there was someone else invested in seeing it finished. And it just eventually, at some point, it just had to be done. Or at least I thought at the time that it had to be done. I didn't realize that one could, of course...
It had to be stopped.
Yeah. And... I mean, this is something that painters have. This is something that artists have of any kind. This capacity to keep going and going and going and tweaking and revising and changing. I think a lot of the best writers certainly have that. I almost want to call it a weakness. It's a very important instinct, but it can be dangerous.
Well, I used to run a small press, and I published Samuel Delany. This, you know who he is.
Sure.
Did a chapbook of one of his pieces, and this is 2001, around that. Every day he would call. Now, we were printing it, and it was a freebie with the collection of his letters that we'd published. And there would just be more changes. And I had to keep track of every change, every changed edition, because the papers that were being collected of his up in Boston, they needed each one of these to be sequentially different.
Oh, wow.
Literally every day. Eventually I told him, Chip, I have a job that you're calling me at to do these right now. I really have to do my job. Otherwise there's no money to put out your books. But yeah, he just... Well, if you just change this paragraph to this, it shouldn't change the flow of the entire. And of course, it changed the flow of the entire thing. Yeah. It was a nightmare. But he just had that propensity, I guess.
I think a lot of people do, but I also think that as people spend more time in the job and gain more experience, they kind of learn how to game their own neurosis and find ways to just sort of let go. For me, I know in advance that when the book reaches the point that we're going through the first pass and the second pass and the galleys are already being printed and we're down to that sort of, the window is closing, it's like James Bond where he needs to like slide under like the iron gates that are swinging shut. I just know that I'll be absolutely miserable and insufferable for that period of a few weeks, and that I will lose my ability to keep my neuroses in check because, of course, suddenly everything is forever and there's no wiggle room. But I know that's going to happen. When it happens, I can recognize that, that it's a temporary state of mind. And in my case, at least, somehow when the book is printed and it's, someone else's sort of stamp has been put on it, it's out of my hands. I can see it visually just by looking at the dust jacket or anything, or the ISBN information inside. Then I know that I will magically let go of it and not second guess it anymore, as long as I never open the book and read it.
Did you warn your wife about
Oh yes, I warned her. I warned her, and yet she was nonetheless horrified by my state of mind.
Yeah, it's one thing to tell, but if you know what's happening, why do you let it happen? And that's the
yeah. So I just kind of hid down in the basement for quite a while.
Gotcha. Where did writing begin for you?
In what sense?
Deciding you were going to be a writer. Or discovering that you were a writer.
Yeah, no. In my case, it was kind of amusing, I think, because I, from a very early age, I think, knew that I wanted to be, a quote-unquote artist of some kind. Mm-hmm. But I didn't narrow it down to writing until, I guess I've narrowed it down now. But, I had a period of time.
You've heard the Tommy Lee Jones story, right?
Yeah.
About the quarterback of...
I don't think I have. I've heard a lot of Tommy Lee stories.
When did you really focus on acting, Tommy? Well, when I realized I was never going to be the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah.
How old were you? Around 40.
That's how I feel exactly. I played in a lot of bands. When I was in high school, I thought I was, I got really into stop motion animation in my basement. I had like a little Super 8 camera and like Play-Doh and was trying to make things happen there. I went through a period of time where I was doing a lot of screenwriting. I was a visual art major for a couple years in college. Just you name it. At some point, I kind of floundered around in that sort of subcategory of art making. And writing was the only thing that seemed to go well, to be honest. So it was almost more a question of doors closing or windows being lowered, and then, one sort of window still being open that I kind of hopped through. And that didn't really happen until I was probably 30.
Yeah. I always used to call my day job career by attrition, just because of the things that had to keep not happening for me to end up doing what I did.
That's how I feel.
You know.
Yeah, career by attrition, that covers it pretty much.
And then there's a will that makes more books rather than, decides to go get a day job.
Yeah, no, it seems like the right thing for me to do. And it's not that I hate doing it by any means. I do think that, playing drums in Queens of the Stone Age would probably be more fun on a daily basis. But I'm also glad I'm not doing that, because I don't really like Queens of the Stone Age.
It's a weird question, and this one ties into what writing as a career means. Granta, in, was it 2007, 2008, you were one of the writers under 40 at that point, because you're my age. So you would have been a young writer. I guess.
Granta had, I don't know what their cutoff age was. I think it was more like 35.
Okay, so right about there. But a sense of having to live up to some sort of billing like that, or, any sense of, oh God, now I've got this thing on me that, the next book has to be meaningful in some certain way, or did you not let that sort of thing get to you?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I actually, and this is kind of an embarrassing thing to say, but
laughed it off.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I think before my first book came out, all I thought about was, will it be taken seriously? I felt that when I was a teenager, when I was young and I was writing and doing other sort of creative things, I was never taken seriously. It used to drive me insane. In fact, when I was in 8th grade, I think it was, I tried to write a novel. It was going to be a thriller, a kind of like a...
action adventure type?
No, it was going to be more like I guess a little bit like an Eric Ambler sort of thriller, kind of somewhere between James Bond and John le Carré. I don't know. I wanted it to be like a real grown-up book, Yeah. And I remember it started with a murder of like a wealthy man who was kind of disliked by everyone, right? So everyone had a motive to kill him, that kind of thing. And the first sentence was something like, Old Man Withers was without a doubt the most ornery old fart in the village, or something like that. And I remember I wrote a few pages, brought it to my parents, expecting to just blow their minds. And they were very good about it. They sat me down and they said, oh, John, we think that this really shows a lot of promise, and, this would be a wonderful project for you to pursue. But are you sure you want to use the word fart in the first sentence? And that was this moment where the scales dropped from my eyes, and I was like, they don't take me seriously. No one takes me seriously. So until the age of 30, roughly when my first book came out, that was kind of all I really thought about. Will this be taken seriously? Will it be well received? Will it get some good reviews and all that kind of thing? And I really thought that was sort of like the final portal. If you can find an agent, if the agent can find you a publisher, and if your book can get published, you're done. You go through that hoop, and that's the last hoop.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of float around on an inflatable chair in a nice sort of lukewarm pool with all the other geniuses, and you're just set for life. And when my first book came out and it got good reviews and it sold terribly, my whole focus changed. And ever since then, I've just been worrying about the fact that my books don't sell enough. I mean, I still want them to be good, but, none of my books really sell well enough that I can kind of completely put that preoccupation aside. Yeah. So I'm always trying to sort of, in my mind, game the system, and by finding that sweet spot in which I can write a book that I will really think of as a great book, or at least a good book, but that will also find a readership and sell copies, And a couple of times in my career that's happened more or less, but not with enough regularity that, things like past praise, giving me something that I have to live up to. I in a way, I still think of myself as not having yet achieved success, and therefore past success doesn't really loom very large in my mind, I would say.
Okay.
If that makes sense, I don't know.
No, I'm with you. That's what I was curious about, whether we'll just say literary fiction because we're going to ghettoize everything. You know, the pressures of that. And I'm glad you talked about the commercial aspects of it, the nature of, it'd be nice if it sold more. And to me, not having read your other novels, wanting to read several of your other novels, this seems accessible, Gone to the Wolves. At least my experience with it, I don't see anything that somebody would say, I don't understand what he's writing about. You know, it's an immediate visceral experience and very, very skillfully captures what the relationships are like and what friendships really are. And captures the scene.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I think after 20 years of writing, I've suddenly or gradually reached the conclusion that if you have fun writing the book, people will probably have fun reading it. And that kind of very basic, simplistic formulation is about as close to wisdom as I've achieved in these past decades.
Yeah, I felt bad. I told Matt Ruff with his latest Lovecraft Country sequel, I said, I feel bad it took you 4 years because it took me 4 hours because your writing is, so energetic and just sweeps me along. I know it took you a long time to write, but he's like, yeah, no, don't worry. Part of it was making it that good and that easy to catch you up as a reader.
Of course, making something seem effortless, it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah. Tell me about community and this house and what it's the sense of being part of a community of writers.
Well, I was an only child, and growing up, I always wanted siblings. And then about 10 years ago, I was kind of wandering around this neighborhood, feeling pretty down about my living situation. And I found this ruined brownstone. Really, it had no windows, it had no electricity or anything, with a little for sale sign kind of written in ballpoint pen and stuck on the door. And almost out of desperation, I knew I had to leave where I was living. I checked it out, and to make a long story short, triangulated all sorts of different things and came up with a way that I could afford to kind of buy this sort of ruin. And then over the course of many years, gradually get it fixed up, and then made a little money. The money went into the house, the story that everybody tells who's had to renovate any sort of building. And then I ended up with this space that had a couple more rooms than I needed, which is a very rare thing in New York City. Sure, obviously. Yeah. Even having one room is hard enough in this town now. And then almost without any sort of premeditation, started renting out some of the rooms as little offices or writing rooms to people that I knew. And that over the course of a few years grew into a real community, and we gave the house a name, Camp Cedar Pines, because we found like a weird pennant on the street. And it really became something that I never could have anticipated. And so many great writers whose work I admire have worked here in the past or are working here now, or hopefully will work here in the future. And of course, it helps me with my bank payments. So sure, that's no small part of it.
But that sense of building a writing community, knowing that writers are a superstitious, cowardly lot, as Batman tells.
That's true.
But yeah, the writers can be a little awkward around each other. That sense of I don't want to say safe space, just creating a place for them like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the type of writer who will sign on to rent an office here is probably not going to be extremely introverted. They're probably going to do it because they might like a little company during their day. And so the way it works is, people's doors are closed.
I was going to ask, are there ground rules?
That is the only ground rule other than don't be an asshole. The only other ground rule is keep your door closed when you want to be left alone. If your door is open, that means that you're okay with the chat, and that works pretty well.
I did notice you did a video podcast recently, and in the basement you've got some drum set going on.
Oh, yeah.
Are there rules and times for, if I drum now, they're probably not going to hear me upstairs. But
I thought you were going to ask if there were rules and times for use of the drum kit in the basement, and the rule is nobody plays my drums with me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I figured there's that. But, I just figured, do you have things that they probably can't hear me and I need to go nuts right now?
just recently put in a second set of doors on the stairs going down. It's pretty well soundproof down there. Okay. The friends of mine who rent the garden apartment from me, they have to be out and about for me to play. But they have jobs, they have places they need to go. So there's plenty of time during the day when I can, I have my little desk down there and my chair and a lamp, and then I have a drum kit and some other things down there, some other instruments. And where I, once upon a time would have had a cigarette, take a smoke break when I just, needed to stand up and stop working. Now I just go and play the drums for 2 or 3 minutes. And it's, I think, actually a million times better than having a cigarette break.
Favorite drummer?
I'm just going to be boring and say John Bonham.
I was going to go with Bonham. I thought you might throw Keith Moon out there as a funny one. But
I'm actually kind of anti-Keith Moon, to be honest.
Too sloppy?
No, not too sloppy, too flashy. He's showing off all the time. Whereas to me, John Bonham was more than anything when he was a songwriter. He wrote rhythm parts the way that anyone else would write a song. A little bit like Ringo Starr, I suppose, but a better drummer.
Well, that was a weird thing when Ringo got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, seeing all of these modern, to us modern people from the last 30 years, drummers talking about how good he was.
Well, I think that Ringo is an amazing drummer.
Yeah.
I just think John Bonham was the greatest drummer.
Sure,
so therefore he is slightly better than Ringo.
Understood.
But I'll take Ringo over Keith Moon or Ginger Baker, any of these flashy drummers, if we're just talking about classic rock drummers,
Yeah, and Animal from the Electric Mayhem also.
Well, of course.
Which is still the greatest band name of all time, I think. The Electric Mayhem.
It is a perfect name.
Yeah, hands down. And the Muppet movie gave us a lot, along with that. But
that's true.
Literary influences? Well, you mentioned the James Bond Le Carré when you were a kid, but, who are you really reading that kind of...
I feel like there are a lot of writers who will tell you, I don't really have that many influences per se. And I feel exactly the opposite about it. I feel like I've been profoundly influenced by every single book I ever read, at least every one that I stuck around with and finished,
How old were you when you figured out that life is too short to waste time on shitty novels?
Wow, I think right at the beginning.
Okay.
I was like a lazy student.
It took me a while because I went I have to read this all the way through eventually.
No, I was such a lazy student. I used to skip novels that I knew even at the time were masterpieces for school, I've skipped a lot of stuff and dropped out of a lot of books. And I'm proud of it in a way because it just means I can conserve my energy and time and read something that I think is really great.
So the influences or the great ones for you.
I think every book has slightly different influences. There'll be writers who seem more appropriate or more useful to the kind of book I'm trying to write, because I don't really write the same book every time. Mm-hmm. They tend to have a different mood and a different language a little bit. And I do that on purpose because, as I said before, if you spend 3 or 4 or 5 years writing something, you should be pretty sick of it by the time you're done and want to do something pretty different, I would say for Gone to the Wolves, Dennis Johnson was a really big influence. I had read Tree of Smoke a long time before I started the book, but I had a copy with me down in Mexico where I was living with my wife, and it just got read and reread a lot and was kind of tattered by the end, because there was not so much what he was writing about, but the rhythm and the kind of feeling of his language in that book specifically was close to the kind of mood I was going for with Gone to the Wolves. So even though Tree of Smoke is about American Vietnam in the 70s and Gone to the Wolves is about heavy metal in the 80s and 90s, there's not a lot of overlap there, although there might be a little. Still, I do think if you read the two side by side, you would recognize a certain rhythmic relationship at least.
Are there writers you avoid when you're writing for fear of sort of getting? Well, yeah, sure. Are there writers you avoid?
Sure.
Once you're going?
I avoid any writer who's a big deal at the moment.
I've been
almost
doing that for
always.
50 years.
Almost always, because either I won't think they're as great as everyone says, which will then cause me to be very frustrated and irritable, or they really will be as great as everyone says, in which case I'll be kind of swamped by their magnificence. And, you need a little breathing room. I tend to, usually read writers who haven't, or I read books by writers that came out 10 years ago and were celebrated as masterpieces 10 years ago. Somehow that's like, there's enough distance that they're not going to just overwhelm me. Like right here in this room, there's Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which I never read at the time because it was just too much. There was too much hullabaloo. And now I find it more approachable, and I'm reading Wolf Hall and I'm really enjoying it.
I was going to make the joke. I'm still waiting on Zadie Smith. I figure I'll get to that and finally get I get it now. She was really good, and I just missed this entire thing for 15 years. But
depending on which book you pick up.
Yeah. How's New York changed for you?
It's changed dramatically. I mean, when I first got here, the 80s had just ended, and there were a lot of really terrible things about New York in those days. I mean, the first week that I moved to New York, I was living in this little crappy apartment on Houston and Allen, sort of like edge of the Lower East Side. And I saw someone get shot outside my window. I literally saw someone get shot and killed. Watched the body twitching while the ambulances came. I think that was my third day in town. Someone pulled a knife on me 2 days later. All the women I knew were being mugged very violently around Alphabet City at the time, I remember, and also some men that I knew. So in that way, you can walk almost anywhere in New York City now, anytime you want, day or night. That's incredible. That's certainly not the way it was when I was first here. On the other hand, most of my friends can't live here anymore. Yeah. And obviously, to me, that matters a little bit more. And I do mourn for, I grieve for the New York that still sort of existed when I got here. But that's the classic thing about New York City, right? It's
always 10 years before you were here.
It's always 10 years before you showed up.
Yeah. Or as Fran Lebowitz says, well, when you were in your 20s is the best place you ever were. Because you were in your 20s. You had everything.
That's right. Yeah, that's for sure.
I always shudder to ask this one because of the jinx factor, but with Gone to the Wolves now done and out, working on another book?
I'm actually not working on anything at the moment. I'm working on...
Is that a good feeling?
It is. Well, it's a good feeling. It's mostly because of having a small child and realizing that I've imposed on my wife quite a bit over the last year or two, finishing up the book, then doing promotion for the book and all this stuff. I think it's my turn to sort of do a bit more. And so that actually feels pretty good, I mean, it would be different if I had no idea what I was doing and had no other claims on my time. It's pretty easy to justify childcare as being at least as important as writing a novel.
You would think, but you know enough writers.
Well, that's true.
Not necessarily personally, but
yes, personally.
I know. I wasn't going to say it though, but
but I'm looking forward to maybe spending a little bit of time not immediately jumping into the next thing, which for 20 years I pretty much directly would jump into the next thing almost before the last project was done. And in part that was financially motivated. You don't get paid enough money as a writer, given the amount of time it takes to do things and finish things, to really have the luxury very often of not working, But right now, with my wife going back to work and various other things, I think I can take a little time and just focus on Julian.
What's fatherhood taught you? And is the next book going to be a Paul Reiser fatherhood?
I tell you what, fatherhood has taught me that
at our age,
I'm a lot older than I thought I was.
I was going to say the energy at 52 is a lot different than 30 years old, like my parents were when they had me.
I mean, I think I would have been a crappy father at 30 or 35 because I really am one of those people who wants to do everything and see everything and doesn't want to ever miss out on anything and have all the adventures and do all the stuff. But the drawback is that I really am tired all the time. And somehow my wife manages to find the energy, and she just may be a more functional sleeper than I am or something. But I almost feel as though I can't keep that many balls in the air, and maybe I'll be a halfway adequate father if I'm not agonizing over some sort of book that I'm trying to get written. I mean, pretty soon I'll have to jump back in, but for at least 6 months, I kind of want to just, we took Julian out the other day to the park, and I was supposed to show him how to fly a kite because he'd read a book, that was all about kite flying. And I think it'll take me about 6 months of intense work and effort even to get to the point of being able to fly a kite. So maybe that's my project for the next 6 months.
You learn together.
It's
it
really
makes it seem
hard.
like it's more of well, I don't know what the space is like. I'm used to, when I was a kid growing up, it was like out on a beach and you had all that room to keep running and running
a lot
and running.
of wind.
Yes, yeah.
But the disadvantage to the beach is that you can only run in a sort of linear way back and forth. Whereas up here in the park, in Prospect Park, there is a big wide open space and it's sort of elevated. I mean, there is enough wind, there's enough space. I really have no excuse for the fact that I just could not keep this goddamn kite in the air.
Blame the curse of New York.
Also, my son is, not even 3 years old yet. Maybe he thinks that's what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, see?
It's
long as you're not watching YouTube videos of this stuff.
He really enjoyed watching it smash into the ground. So maybe, as long as no one tells him that's not what it's supposed to do, I'll be fine.
Dad failed again. Yeah. You do mention the wanting to go out and do everything. For your previous novel, you actually went to Afghanistan as part of research. Any travel related to Gone to the Wolves?
Yeah.
Did you actually go to Norway or anywhere else?
Yeah.
Okay.
It
feels very experienced, but I just don't know. Well, maybe he's a good writer. But
that was part of the fun. I spent some time down in middle of nowhere, Florida, in part through friends that I'd made and people who could show me around down there. LA, I had a bit more experience with because my dad was from just north of Los Angeles, so I kind of knew that part of the country a bit better. But then, yes, because the third section of the novel is really about these two friends who have never even seen snow close up, traveling to Norway in the middle of the winter to try and find their lost third friend, part of this sort of triangle that's at the center of the novel. I also went to Norway, not just to Norway and to the places they go, but in the middle of winter in early February, which was a very memorable experience, that's for sure. I definitely asked myself a few times when I was there whether I couldn't why couldn't I just have gone in July and sort of use my imagination? Writers are supposed to have imagination. But I went, it was pitch black all the time, really, really cold. The people were amazingly friendly. I had amazingly delicious food. I visited all these churches that had been burned and have since been beautifully reconstructed. That trip to Norway was unforgettable and in fact was amazing. I would go there again in the middle of winter at the drop of a hat.
Again, get away from the kid. I'm just kidding.
Sorry, Daddy can't change your diapers today because he is in Norway.
Playlist for the book?
I have a couple playlists. I have various playlists for the book. I have one that I made for my publisher because people at FSG don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge of metal. And that playlist is a bit of a kind of beginner's introduction. It's sort of the gentle easing in to the deeper end of the pool. And it starts with bands like, of course, Black Sabbath and Motorhead and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, and then moves into sort of the glam metal, still kind of easing things in until sort of 2/3 of the way through, things start to get a little rough. But then there's the playlist that I made for people who might actually buy the book and read it, about whom I make the assumption that they're, if not knowledgeable about metal, because they shouldn't need to be. This is not supposed to be a book.
I don't have a huge background in it, and I was completely, it internally holds up.
I sort of wanted it to be a book for people who knew nothing about it, But nevertheless, I did make a playlist for readers of the book that's a bit more intense, Yeah.
We'll use that as part of the soundtrack for this thing. But
sure, I can hook you up with it.
I guess the question that always terrifies my guests, who are you reading?
Right now, I am reading a book. It's actually an easy question for me to answer because mostly I'm reading books that I'm considering sharing with my son. So I've been reading a lot of
Henry Miller. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Go on. He'll get there on his own eventually, maybe. Although I would have very strong feelings about which Henry Miller books he should read.
I got into a fight with Daryl Pinckney over this because I champion Tropic of Cancer in a certain email that I send out, and he just, no, Quiet Days and Cliche, that's the only one. I'm like, okay, fine, Daryl, you're better read than I am.
I think you guys are both right.
Yeah, I like to think so.
Just don't read The Air-Conditioned Nightmare.
No, my Miller comes from the touchstone of George Orwell's essay, ostensibly about Henry Miller, Inside the Whale, which I've been reading / listening to for 30 plus years.
Right.
So yeah, anyway, go on. But things you're considering with your kid.
I'm reading a book now called The King of Ireland's Son, which was put together by a folklorist and scholar in Dublin who was good friends with James Joyce. I think they were drinking buddies, which is the only kind of buddy you could really be with James Joyce. But it's a really wonderful book that is kind of like an amalgamation of all of these ancient Irish folk tales that have been very kind of cleverly spun into more or less a single through narrative. So it almost reads like a novel, but it incorporates, probably 100, if not more, Irish folk tales. And I have an older sister who told me that was her son's favorite book at a certain age. So I've been reading that and finding it really fantastic. The King of Ireland's Son, it's called.
And last book, you foisted off on other people, just finished it and said, holy crap, you have to go read this.
I think the last book that I really foisted off on people, not that they were resistant.
No, but at least that you were enthusiastic about.
Was My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by Amos Tutuola, the famous Nigerian
I was going to say, I didn't know that David Byrne and Brian Eno did a book about that. So good. Okay.
They ripped him off. They ripped him off for that album. And as much as I like that album, the book is much, much better.
Yeah.
He wrote a number of books that are all kind of part of almost like one larger meta novel that also incorporates a lot of Nigerian folk tales and so on. He wrote his masterpiece is probably this book called The Palm Wine Drinkard, which was Dylan Thomas's favorite book, strangely enough. And I happen to have a couple copies that have a really wonderful, crazy kind of phantasmagorical dust jacket.
Yeah.
So people accept the book gratefully just for the dust jacket, and then I trick them into reading the interior.
You're a collector?
I'm an accumulator.
There's that too.
How like
accretion disc that forms around us.
Comic book kids, when you're looking at like the 12-year-old kids buying comics, there are the kids who buy multiple copies of the comic and keep it in a bag and board and a baggie. Yeah. And then there are the kids who just have tattered comic books littering the floor. And I was always one of those kids. So when I think about a collector, I think about people who think of like resale value and stuff like that. I'm just a consumer who ends up with a lot of crap in his house.
Your comic, what sort of comics were you reading as a kid? Did you come up with the Marvel or DC side, basically?
Definitely the Marvel side.
Good. Okay.
It depends on what age you're talking about. I was a big Fantastic Four fan, a big X-Men fan.
Okay. Were you reading the X-Men and Frank Miller's Daredevil at way too young an age, like 9 or 10 years old?
I think Frank Miller had maybe a slightly pernicious effect on me.
Yeah, okay, same here. So we do have a lot in common as far as that goes.
I've been in recovery from Frank Miller for a few decades now, about 40 years.
With my last guest, I explained how he and I met at a party once, and I didn't realize who he was. This is 2003.
He's an infamous jerk, isn't he?
No. Well, in this case, he wasn't. We were getting along. I know. But
maybe it's just that he's like...
I think his public persona might be jerk-like, but we were at a party with Samuel Delaney. And,
wow, that's quite a party. Frank Miller and Samuel Delaney at the same party?
Oh, yeah, they were friends once upon a time.
I'm surprised by that.
The two of us went on a beer run, and... eventually I figured out that, wait a second, you're Frank Miller. Maybe 20 minutes into our talking. So that was, I think he appreciated the not weird vibe.
And then suddenly you got weird.
No, I said this on the last episode. The response I have, and it's something I've really cultivated over the years, anytime there is someone whose work you at least did have an effect on you, even if it doesn't now.
Yeah.
Your work has really meant a lot to me over the years.
There you go.
Yep, that's my formulation for it.
Yeah.
You know, that way you don't seem like you're insane, and you don't seem like you're keeping up with every single thing they're doing and
And I think
the
a key thing is to praise someone's work rather than them.
Yeah, that's part of
Saying,
it.
I'm a huge fan
Of yours is not
people.
good. Huge fan of your work is
I think that really
the safer
is,
way.
because that's something you can talk about then.
Yeah.
Or not.
Right. That's been my...
Or you can just go ahead and buy the beer.
Right. When I get to sit down with, artists, writers, musicians, et cetera, who I actually groove on heavily, there's always the, I could nerd out, but you see people nerd out all the time. So your last nerd out, do you have writers that you freak out around or have freaked out around? I think I asked Nathan Englander that in this room.
And he said me.
Well, around Philip Roth, but also you. Yes, of course,
That is so funny that you had a conversation with Nathan in this very room, 5 years ago or something?
2019, 4 years. So.
I once bumped into David Bowie and completely, I basically went from solid to liquid in about 30 seconds.
That's perfectly understandable. That's
the
story I got on the show years ago. Irvin Welsh and I recorded, and I asked him that sort of question. He told me he stood up David Bowie twice for interviews because at the last minute he could not bring himself. He's like, how could I had his posters on my wall? How could I possibly sit down with that man and do an interview?
And Bowie's like, who the fuck does this guy think he is?
He just freaked out, and I'm like, you probably insulted your hero, but
he was probably pretty pissed off. Yeah,
but
that's funny.
You had the David Bowie experience.
I'm glad that doesn't weigh on my conscience. Having stood up David Bowie, I don't know if I could recover from that guilt.
When you say bumped into, physically,
on the street,
but physically bumped into, or just
almost physically bumped into him. We had to we were crossing Broadway, and we had to sort of negotiate to get around each other, which is the only reason that I really noticed him. And I was with my girlfriend at the time, and we took about 4 or 5 more steps, and she said, "That was David Bowie." And then she turned around and she said, "David!" And he stopped in the middle of Broadway. The light was already changing. He spun neatly about on his heels, blew her a kiss, gave her a wink, and kept walking. It was so beautiful. It was so elegant. It was perfect.
It's New York, man.
And that's why David Bowie is and was David Bowie.
I'm hip. I'll tell you about the richest man I ever physically bumped into when we're off mic. But, John, thanks so much for coming on the show. And thanks for this book, because my wife was like, that book cover, what are you reading? I'm like, yeah. When I explained it, she's like, oh, no, that makes perfect sense. Okay, this is fantastic. So,
well, it has that sort of rainbow sheen. That's supposed to indicate that it's actually fun.
Yeah. And you've got the old Beavis and Butthead, jagged lettering. So that's always good. Or Headbanger's Ball, however we want to credit it to. But, John, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gil. It's been a great chat.
And that was John Wray. Go read his new book, Gone to the Wolves. It's out now from FSG. It is a blast. I think you got a lot of what this book is about and how much I enjoyed it through the conversation. So I'm not going to tell you any more, except to repeat, you do not need to be a metalhead to dig this novel. Trust me, you will get swept up in it really, really easily. Now, you should follow John through his website, which is johnwray.net, JOHNWRAY.net, and on Twitter as John_Ray, and Instagram as The John Ray, all one word. I'll have links to all that in the show and episode notes for this one, along with the 2 playlists that accompany the book. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there's this podcast, comes out every week, really interesting conversations with writers, artists, cartoonists, musicians, and all sorts of other creative folks. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards. A letter, email, DM, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, you'll get cut off. Just call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something neat that we want to share with listeners, but I would never do that without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, there's expenses for the show, but that's why I have a day job and all that. So if you do have money to spare, I hope you'll give it to individuals or institutions in need. And you can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, or one of the other crowdfunding platforms. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank. I make contributions to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but that's part of my day job. But I also contribute to Freedom Funds, Planned Parenthood, and other funds that, if you give to, you can maybe help us build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.